curves tend to cause a lot of confusion, especially the RGB curves. So if the S curve is the only curve that you know, you're missing out on quite a lot. So we're first going to start with the RGB curves, get out of the way and why you shouldn't use it, and then we're going to move on to the global curves and what you can use there on top of your S curve for you to get really the results that you're looking for. So let's get started. RGB curves. So one thing that I see a lot of people doing is to create an S curve in the red channel and then copy the channel settings, paste in the green channel, and then paste in the blue channel. Same curve in all three RGB channels. What do you think you have accomplished here? Well, let's investigate. Let's get a snapshot of this and let's call it curves RGB. And now let's reset all of this. And now let's paste that same curve in the global channel. Now this is exactly equivalent to what we did with the RGB curves. So let's prove this by grabbing a snapshot, call it curves global. And now let's compare with the RGB and with the global. The RGB and the global. It is an exact pixel by pixel match, and that proves to us that the global curve is a sum of the R, G, and B curves. And if the R, G, and B curves are identical, it's just an overcomplicated way of creating a global curve. This might seem obvious, but the trouble is that I've bought quite a few preset packs, and one preset pack that was insanely popular and very, very advertised on Instagram. And what it did was exactly this. It had a curve that had very, very, very similar S curves in all three channels. They differed by a small amount. And my suspicion is that the creator of that preset didn't really understand, didn't have a game plan when he attacked these curves to create the look that we wanted. He just pushed it up and down to see what worked, and the only curve that he knew about was the S curve. And he ended up with three very similar curves that could have been just a global curve like this with perhaps a small amount of these curves being dragged up and down to create a real look, a look that has intention behind. So that made me completely lose trust in the preset pack, and I completely abandoned it, and here we are. So what's the purpose of these RGB curves? The purpose is to create color casts, okay? So here in the red curve, if I add red, I'm adding red, of course, and if I remove red, I'm actually adding cyan. And the green, same if I can add green or remove green, which is adding magenta. And in the blue channel, adding blue, or the opposite of blue is yellow. So when we remove blue, the yellow has the opportunity to flourish. So for example here, if we wanted to add yellow in the highlights and blue in the shadows, what we would do is add yellow in the highlights and blue in the shadows. So now that we know what we're doing with this curve and we know our intention, we can see that we ended up with something that is actually the opposite of an S curve, right? It's a reverse S curve that we have that, and we shouldn't be afraid of that. That's exactly our intention. It is adding yellow in the highlights and adding blue in the shadows. But the trouble is that when you're doing things this way, now you're stuck with this yellow. And if you want this yellow to be a little bit more orange, for example, you would have to do some magic here. It's like, okay, so what do you have to combine here to create orange in the highlights? Needless to say, that's complicated. So let's reset all of this. And for all intents and purposes, the RGB curves, all they do is create color casts. And there is a better tool for creating color casts in Lightroom, and that is the color grading tool. Here's very simple. If you want to add blue in the shadows, you add blue in the shadows. You click in the shadows here and you add blue. See, blue is being added before, after, before, after. And if you want yellow, you add yellow. If you want orange, you just shift this a little bit. A million times easier. Don't use the tone curve RGB for creating color casts unless you have like that specific need that cannot be satisfied with the color grading tool. Then sure, then you know more than me probably, so you should, do your thing. All right, so my belief is that split toning is accomplished with lighting. So I will leave this untouched, reset everything. And now to the global curve. So now that we've freed ourselves from this mess, what can we do with the global curve? There's a problem with this image that I've hidden a little bit just for the initial explanations, but as it was shot, it was a bit overexposed and blown out like this. This is the original shot. So this is obviously overexposed. So we are going to bring the exposure down, but there's still some blown out areas. We're often confronted with a situation where the dynamic range of the scene is so large and the dynamic range of the camera is also so large that we end up struggling tucking everything into the dynamic range that is available to us here in Lightroom. So one way to work with this is, check this out, activating HDR. But before we do that, let me also introduce another concept here, that saturation and contrast are tightly related. And for that very reason, the first thing that you have to do in every edit is to select a proper profile, because that's going to dictate the contrast level that you have, the base saturation level, the colors, everything. And that's going to be the foundation that's going to guide your editing choices going forward. So if you choose Adobe Color here, shall that be a deliberate choice because you genuinely like the colors it gives. And quite honestly, it is a good profile, but you can do better than that. You can either choose one of the camera specific ones. I developed my own profiles, these cinematic, because I really like this cinematic look. And these do a bunch of things. They add color casts, they add saturation, and they reduce a little bit the contrast. So I'm going to choose, for example, for this image, this cinematic C. You don't have to do that. You can choose whatever profile. Just know that whatever you choose here, it is going to guide your choices going forward, okay? And by the way, if you are interested, you can find these cinematic profiles in the link in the description below. Okay, so what you can see here is that our saturation is through the roof. We're going to deal with that, don't worry. And because the saturation is so high, we're going to want less contrast. That's just a natural development of what happens by choosing a more saturated profile. And now to the fun part. Let's activate HDR and notice that the image becomes absolutely horrendous, and that's because of this preview for SDR display. We're going to deal with this in a second. Just ignore this for and observe that the tone curve now is twice as large, and now we have access to controlling the level of these pixels that are blown out. This is absolute gold. So now we can truly craft how the highlight roll-off of this image is going to look like. So we can replicate how film looks by making a more aggressive highlight roll-off than was possible without activating HDR, if that makes any sense. That was a very long sentence. Activating HDR is not just clicking a button, unfortunately. So I'm gonna always preview for HDR display because that's always how I'm going to deliver this image. And when I click this button, I don't want anything to change. And for that to happen, there's a very specific combination. Grab your pen and paper because you're gonna want to copy this and create a preset from this. Let's go. Contrast to 0, clarity to 0, highlights to 100, shadows to 0, no, it's not 0, minus 100, whites to plus 100, and highlight saturation. This is to taste, but I keep it at plus 100. And now that we've done that, look here. Ta-da! Before and after clicking this button, the image is unaffected. I have absolutely no idea why the developers at Adobe decided that the null or no op state of these sliders would be these crazy values. And this is not documented. This is my own effort trying to figure out this thing. So you're welcome. Make sure to copy this. You are going to need this sooner or later. And now we're ready to start crafting our highlight roll-off curve. So the first thing that I do is bring this all the way to the end and make sure that this curve will never pass this limit here. So we're never going to clip ever again. And the next step is the first part of the curve, this bottom area, I want to keep the contrast in this area unaffected. if this first segment is more inclined than 45 degrees, we're adding contrast in the area. If it is less inclined than 45 degrees, we are reducing contrast in the area. I like to keep it unadulterated. And now just naturally we end up with some kind of curve here that we can further craft. All right, like that. And so all of these blown out pixels, if you look in the histogram, I've tucked them back in by quite a margin. And if you can see, this entire area of the image has a lot less contrast than what we started with, okay? And the reason why we still like this low contrast is because the profile had given us so much color to start with. So if you started with Adobe Color, for example, that has a little bit more subdued colors, you might want more contrast at this stage, so these points might end up a little bit higher. It is your creative decisions. Don't copy what I'm doing here, okay? Do your own thing, explore. This is completely different from an S-curve. This is also a contrast curve, but it has nothing to do with an S-curve anymore. So now if we go back to the basic panel, now we can start exploring, like, what happens with the exposure when it gets processed afterwards by that intense highlight roll-off. We can get these sort of overexposed film look, or we can simply just readjust it to a level that we enjoy. Before we had -1, but because our curve ended up so low, now we're gonna raise a little bit our exposure. Doesn't matter by how much. And at this point, if you're so inclined, you can still bring down a little bit the highlights, bring down a little bit of the whites. And just a note, whenever you use the highlight and the shadow slider, also reduce the clarity, because these sliders are sneaky and behind the scenes they add clarity. There's going to be a whole video about that. So let's reduce a little bit the clarity. Right, so this is what we have right now. And now you're asking me, okay, you took a lot of contrast away. What if you want to reintroduce contrast? Okay, yes, one way is to bring it back using the contrast slider, but you can do better than that. What you can do is create a mask that doesn't mask anything, includes all the pixels in the image, and that is done. My favorite way is by creating a luminance range, and for some strange reason for this range to be activated, you need to pretend that you drag this handle and bring it back to 0. So now we have a luminance range that covers all the luminances from 0 to 100. And what we have is a brand new curve to play with. And here, if you want, you can create your famous contrast curve. Here, finally, you have your S-curve to play with. And the advantage of having the S-curve in a mask is because now you have this amount slider, right? I find that this image is already looking good, so it doesn't need all that much contrast. Another thing that people like to do that I find a little bit controversial in my brain, I have a hard time accepting, is also using the same curve for creating a fade. I don't like it. I don't like to use one curve for two different purposes, because Lightroom gives you infinite curves by creating masks. So you can simply come here and duplicate mask 1. So now this is going to be our fade mask. So let's rename it for being tidy, fade. We could rename this one as well. So get the fade curve, reset everything. And now you can want to fade the whites, fade the whites. Want to fade the shadows, fade the blacks, fade the blacks, without creating that S-curve. That's my preference. You might as well create an S-curve here. You don't need to take my word for it, but I prefer it this way because in my brain, this signifies that we are compressing the dynamic range of the image, and therefore the contrast is being reduced as well. So now you also have an amount slider for the fade. If you want more fade, just drag this up. If you want less fade, just drag this down. And that's it. I generally don't like that. And perhaps we can keep the contrast because this image seems to be asking a little bit of contrast. I don't know. Like low contrast it is. Or not. Editor Lucas here, and in retrospect, I can see that you might be screaming at me saying that you want deeper shadows and brighter highlights. How do I do that without affecting my colors? Well, there is a solution. Let's say that we want a lot of contrast here, deeper shadows and brighter highlights, but now the colors of our image are disgusting, but you still have the refine saturation slider. That is going to be your savior. And independently on this refine saturation slider, you also have in our fade mask another refine saturation slider. But I still prefer the image as it was before. I still prefer the low contrast version of it. Back to the video. Right, so now we have gone through quite a few different curves. We saw in the RGB curves, we did the reverse S curve. We did the highlight roll off curve with the HDR enabled. We also did the fade curve. So go out and explore. And last note here, what would have happened if we didn't choose this profile to start with? So that's why I have other things going on here. So this was the first edit that we started with this image. It's not terrible, to be honest. This is a full edit that I did using purely Adobe Color. This is what I ended up with. And this is what we just did. This is really to my taste, okay? It feels like this could have been a screen grab from a movie, whereas neither this or this is really screaming filmic or cinematic to me, if you will. This has a vibe, this has deep colors, this has a filmic highlight roll-off, this has everything going for it to give a feeling about this photo. And I really enjoy it. Make sure to look in the link in the description below and get this stuff and play with it. And that's it for me today. Hej då!